All right, this is going to be interesting. We're going to go now to the question period, and we're going to start with a 7-minute round with Mr. McKinnon.
Thank you, Chair. I think I'd like to start with Mr. Page here. So you indicated the height might not be a good restriction, but you understand our desire to limit possible diversion. So what would a good restriction be?
Right, I've given this some thought. So is it that 1.5 meters or 2 meters would encompass the majority of plants grown now? And I think that is the case. So we could double or increase by 50% that grow limit, and that would likely catch or encompass more of the typical growing, including outdoor cultivation. I mean, one of the issues is that cannabis is photoperiod sensitive in a technical term. It means it flowers when it is exposed to short days. So if you're growing cannabis inside, you can make those short days occur just by the flick of a timer or a light switch, and sort of force it to flower at 60 centimeters or 80 centimeters or a meter or more. Outside, on the other hand, the day length is, of course, determined by the season. So outdoor cannabis production in Canada now, the flowering starts in August. It might continue through September, depending on where we are in the country. Harvest might be sometime around Thanksgiving, in fact. And what's happening during those long Canadian summers is that the plant is getting quite tall. So if we allow outdoor cultivation for typical climates in Canada, we may be approaching sort of a 2 meter or even a little bit taller plant height by the time flowering occurs. Of course, as I said, you can enforce pruning and people can bend their plant down or something. But I, in general, think if you have a limit, a plant number limit, and if it's 4 flowering plants and a few more to tidy up the sort of gardening issues, as I suggested, I think that's sort of can be the limit. What people do within those 4 plants, if it's 1.5 meters or 2 meters or even 2.5 meters, I'm not sure we should be that concerned also about this 100 centimeter or a height limit. The task force came up with this suggestion of 100 centimeters, and I was sort of puzzled about why that was, and I think it had a lot to do with screening plants in cultivation in people's backyards. So, sort of the height of a typical fence in Canada is about 4 feet by city bylaw, and that would sort of screen out those plants at 100 centimeters. As I indicated in my submission, is that allow the cities to enact those bylaws, and I would just toss out the plant height restriction.
Even though I remember the 60s, I don't know much about growing a pot. What kind of a life cycle is involved here with the plants, and like how long does it take to grow a typical plant? I keep hearing about smell as a problem. We keep hearing about potential problems with mold and property damage. It seems to me I've heard that growing pot is like growing tomatoes, right? That doesn't seem to be a problem with mold and property damage. So maybe you could expand on this area.
Well, I think there's a lot of sort of variability in the approach. If you're a indoor cultivator, you're sort of force flowering the plant, so to speak. So it might be a cycle where you would plant a seed or establish a cutting, and it might grow for 4 weeks or something, and then you would trigger flowering, and then there'd be a flowering period of about 8 weeks. So about 3 months in total, sort of seed to harvest in typical terms. Outdoors, that might be longer, because you would potentially plant in May, when you would plant tomatoes around the Victoria Day long weekend, and be harvesting later in September. So that would stretch out that growing season to more than 3 months or a little bit longer. In terms of the smell, cannabis has a very distinct odor, whether it's smoked or grown. This is not due to THC, but rather due to the so-called the terpenes. These are the sort of volatile components of the plant. The same chemicals that give, mint and lavender and basil, their smell are also terpenes. And they are, quite a powerful odor. And in terms of indoor cultivation, they can be controlled with appropriate ventilation or appropriate filtration, so you can have charcoal filters to remove the smell. But it is a little bit more complicated than tomatoes in the sense that tomatoes don't smell as much. So in terms of some of the issues are that people are pushing larger numbers of plants in closets in their apartments or dwellings, and that smell then in that intense light and indoor confined space is difficult to control.
Okay. Is it possible to detect or to tell if a plant is male or female before you see flowering? And how soon might you see flowering in a plant?
Yeah, there's a few options there. One is that if people are growing from clones, the plants are cloned from female plants, so that's one thing. Feminized seeds are also available, so these are seeds that are produced only to give female offspring. There are more molecular methods to determine males and females. For example, my lab offers a test that you can test at a very early seedling stage. Generally, and again, it's all about the sort of light regime, but you can detect males within several weeks of the triggering of flowering, and then they start to produce a sort of a different floral structure that can be identified, and they can be removed or
if I walk into a home that has a number of green things, I don't know necessarily if I'm a police officer if they're male plants or female plants.
No. So at a seedling stage, a plant that's grown from seed and it's 40 centimeters high or something, the males and females would be virtually indistinguishable.
In terms of controlling the numbers of plants, at some point a seed, we're not counting seeds necessarily, but a seed becomes a plant. So at what point, what would be a good determinant for saying this is a plant and this is not a plant? If you know what I mean. You couldn't necessarily, if you had a bunch of small shoots coming out of the ground, is that something that you want to control for number, or do you need to have a minimum size to say, oh, this is a plant that we're counting or not? Well,
I think at this point everything counts as a plant under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. So seeds are cannabis plants and they're restricted. Importation, for example, is restricted, or sale is restricted. I believe it's the case that if you take a cannabis plant, and this is under the current laws, and take cuttings from that plant and they start rooting, those are also considered plants for the perspective of being charged with plant numbers. So that's the current case. In terms of what, if a plant, if an organism has leaves and it's growing beyond the sort of seed stage, it probably is a plant.
Thank you.
Okay, now we go to Ms. Gladue.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is for you, Mr. Page. Are you familiar with the type of testing and quality control